Hello everyone, it's Robin the Delta Crafter, and I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. I want to start out with an apology. First of all, there is some work being done on my fence. It's being power washed and stained, and so if you hear any noise in the background, that's probably what it is. Today I'm going to be jumping into the June 2022 My Monthly Hero Kit, and we're going to be creating an underwater scene. Let's go ahead and take a look at the items that we'll be using to create this card. You guys know I love the My Monthly Hero kits, and this one is spectacular. This is the 4x6 stamp set that's included. I'll be using that for this card. I'll also be using a couple of the Hero Arts reactive inks. I'm going to start out with Fruit Punch. I'm also going to be using Green Apple, Key Lime Fizz, Pool Party, Blue Raspberry, and Blue Hawaii. These inks react with water, although I'm not going to use that technique today, but that is one of the things that I love about the inks from Hero Arts. I'm also going to be using the Taffy ink, and I only have this one in the small cube. To create the background for this card, I'm going to be doing a little bit of embossing, so I'm going to use the Versamark embossing ink, and then for the sentiment, I'll use the VersaFine Onyx Black ink to stamp my sentiment. So here's that embossing powder that I'm going to be using. This is the sand embossing powder from Hero Arts, which is my #1 favorite embossing powder. And then I'm going to be using a black embossing powder that I just have in my stash. So I'm going to be doing some masking on this card too. And I'm going to use this mint tape from scrapbook.com to do that masking. I really like this low tack tape for that technique. This month's kit came with some pearls, so I'm going to be using those on the card. And then for my card base, I'm going to use my Accent Opaque 120-pound weight cardstock. And then I'm going to be using my Neenah Classic Crest Solar White for my panel in 80-pound weight. And then I'm going to be using a couple of pieces of Bristol Smooth paper for a watercolor technique. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create my inked up background. This is going to create that water scene for our card. The ocean scene that I'm going to be creating is actually going to be at the bottom of the ocean. So I want some sand in this background, and I want different shades or depths of water. So I'm going to use the mint tape to create a mask, and I'm going to take a regular pair of scissors and cut a wave into this mint tape in order to for my sand to not be so flat and regular looking. I want a little bit of a wave that gives me a little bit of movement and texture for my sand. So I've just used a pair of scissors to cut the wave into that mint tape, and now I'm going to apply this to my piece of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White cardstock in order to use this as a mask. So the part that is at the bottom is where I'm going to later on do some embossing. But the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and ink up my background, because again, when you're ink blending, you want to start with your ink blending and do that first to give your ink blending time to dry. So I'm coming in with Pool Party reactive ink from Hero Arts. Then I'm following that up with the Blue Raspberry. And I'm going to overlap my inks to make sure that I get a good blend between the two colors. So the next color that I'm going to use is the Blue Hawaii. So this is going to be my darkest blue color that I'm going to use for my underwater scene. And as I always do in my when I'm ink blending, I've mentioned this before in my videos, I always go back down my inks and blend them in one more time just to ensure that the blend between the colors is nice and neat. And there's a closer look at the blend between all three colors. I think that turned out really well. So now that we've got our ink background, let's go ahead and create the sand. So I'm going to remove that stencil, and you can see the nice crisp clean line that we have between the ink blending and the rest of the background. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in some Versamark ink, and I'm going to take this pad, this Versamark ink pad, direct to paper. And I'm going to rub this Versamark ink pad across the bottom of the paper, being mindful of the wave that I have created at the top. If you get down more a little bit to eye level with the paper, you'll be able to see exactly where you need to go with that ink pad. Now, in order to get close up to the line, I'm going to bring in my Versa marker, which is just a marker that is filled with embossing ink. And I'm going to use that, both ends of that, the broad tip and the fine tip, to get right up to the line, the water line. So I've done that, and now I'm ready to add my embossing powder. This is the sand embossing powder, and if you look at that embossing powder, you can see there's several different colors of embossing powder in there, and the embossing, I guess, pebbles, if you will, are different sizes too. So some of them are chunky, some of them are very fine, and that just adds to the beauty of this embossing powder. Now I got a little bit of embossing powder in places that I don't want it to be, so before I heat set it, I'm going to go ahead and clean that up with a dry paintbrush. And then I mistakenly took a little bit of the embossing powder off where I actually wanted it to be, so I just covered that back up again by sprinkling a little bit more embossing powder on it. So anytime I use the sand embossing powder and a couple of other embossing powders that have those thicker chunks in it, I always like to heat from the back, because those thicker chunks will blow really easily with the heat from the embossing tool. So I like to kind of set them a little bit from the back and then start to melt them from the front. And you can see here we're going to go along and melt this embossing powder, and you can see it start to change as I move my heat tool. So now that I have all of the embossing powder melted, let's take a closer look at this background now. I can feel it. I can see the ocean coming to life. So now that we have the background completed, now it's time to move on to the elements that we'll be including in the card. So I have a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock that I'm going to be stamping my images on. And the reason why I'm using Bristol Smooth is because I'm going to be doing a little bit of watercoloring with the some other reactive inks, and the Bristol Smooth paper takes the water very nicely. So this is one of the papers that I prefer to use. I will also use watercolor paper, but I want this one to be smooth and as opposed to textured like watercolor paper is. So I chose the Bristol Smooth. So now that I've chosen the images that I want to stamp, I'm going to use this VersaFine ink, because I'm going to heat emboss these images onto the Bristol Smooth paper. I'm going to close the door of my MISTI, and that's going to stamp the images onto my my paper. So now that the images have been stamped, now it's time to cover them with this black embossing powder. And again, this is some powder that I just had in my stash. I've probably had this for maybe even a decade. I've had it for quite a while. So I'm going to cover those images and get ready to heat set them. Off camera, I went ahead and heat set those images, and now it's time to color them in. So I'm going to be using these reactive inks and adding some water to them and using them like watercolors. So you can see I have a glass of water over to the top, and then I have my small paintbrush. I think this might be a 2, maybe even a 0. I think it's a 2 paintbrush, but it's very thin. And I'm going to use this to paint in my images using these reactive inks. So you can see there I've kind of put some water on half of the ink that I smushed down, and I'm going to leave the other half true ink, and therefore that'll allow me to kind of get 2 different shades out of this one ink. So I'm going in with this paintbrush, and I'm going to just paint in this coral with the Fruit Punch ink. I'm going to cover this whole entire coral, and then you can see where I'm coming into straight ink, and I'm going to use that side to add some highlights to the coral. So that's going to give me some darker areas with the coral. For the sea grass, I think that's what that is, I'm going to use the Key Lime Fizz. I'm going to come in with that brighter green first. And then I'm going to add some highlights to this image with some green apple. And that's going to add a lot of movement and texture to these images. And I really like the way these two colors melded together. It's really pretty. For the fish and the seashell, I'm going to be using two different colors. I'm first going to come in with the blue raspberry, and I'm going to add a little bit of that to each of these images. And just like I did with the fruit punch, I'm going to leave a little bit of the blue raspberry ink without water on it, so it's a more concentrated color. And I'm going to come into the areas and add some highlights with that concentrated ink color. Now I'm going to put a little bit of that blue raspberry onto the shell, and then move on to the taffy. So the taffy is a pink color. So I wanted my fish to be kind of blue and pink. So I'm adding some taffy here, and I'm also going to have a little bit of that concentrated ink to add some highlights in that area, in the taffy areas as well. So I'm going to finish up this seashell with the taffy, and that's going to finish up the watercoloring with the reactive inks. So let's take a look at these images up close. There you can get a better idea of the highlighted areas that were added with the inks. So we're getting close to being ready to assemble the card, but before we do that, we need to make sure that we get our sentiment stamped down. So I'm bringing in the Hello sentiment from the stamp set from the kit, and I'm inking that up with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I really love this ink because it's always so nice and crisp, and that's what I wanted for to make a great impression on this card. So now that we've got our sentiment stamped down, it's time to start assembling. You guys know that I love my dimension, so it should be no shock or surprise that I'm going to add some foam tape to the back of the card panel to pop it up off of the card base. So I've got several strips of foam tape on the back of the card panel. I'm going to adhere this card panel to the card base. Again, that card base is made from Accent Opaque 120-pound weight cardstock. I'll have most of the products that I'm using today linked and listed on my blog post that coordinates with this video. Now I'm going to kind of dry fit some of my elements to kind of figure out where I want different things to be. I'm going to be using the Scotch quick drying tacky glue to adhere down my the two taller elements here, the ones that are going to be adhered directly to the card panel. And then I'm going to use some of my favorite foam dots or foam adhesive to pop up the fish and the seashell. Those foam adhesives are from Stampin' Up, and they have been my favorites for a very long time. So while those two elements are drying, I'm going to put an acrylic block on the top of them to give them a little bit of weight. One thing I want to point out is that when I use my foam dots, I don't let anything go to waste. I use even the strips that are on the side because they are sticky too, and they have foam and they can help pop things up. So they'll fit into tricky places like the tail of that fish. So now it's time to adhere the fish to the card panel, but before I do that, I kind of want to see where I want it to be, and so I'm going to... The seashell kind of needs to be in the picture too for me to make sure that I like the placement. So before I put the fish down permanently, I'm going to see where I want the seashell. Put some foam tape or foam squares on the back of that seashell to pop it up as well. I have one last element that I want to add to this card, and that is the pearl. I'm going to add a pearl into the middle of the seashell using some tacky glue, and once I do that, this card will be complete. Now this is an underwater scene that I would love to go snorkeling and see. Leave me a comment below and let me know if you've ever been snorkeling or have been somewhere where you could see the bottom of the ocean. I'd love to know what you were able to see. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and joining the Delta Crafter family by hitting the subscribe button and notification bell to be notified of when I post new videos. You can always find me on Instagram and Facebook at The Delta Crafter, and be sure to visit my website at thedeltacrafter.com for more details on today's card. I hope you have a great day, everyone. Enjoy!